Welcome to Studies in the Truth. I am Brother Mitch. Hello again. Today we're going to talk about man's sin. Okay, as we've mentioned before, that man was created like Yahweh, like his Elohim, in the fact that he was righteous. He was created without sin. Okay, he was also created in two parts. One part is spiritual, that part of him which is like Yahweh. And another part of him was physical, which is the part of him that is like the other creatures, like the physical creation. Once he was created, he was placed in this garden, okay? And in this garden, there were true trees. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life, which if a man eats it, he can live forever. Okay, Yah then gave him a wife, okay? And in chapter 3 of Genesis, we see that the wife was manipulated. Okay, it says beguiled by the serpent, which is a title of the devil later in Scripture. What he convinced her to do was to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which they were told not to do. Yahweh told them, "In the day that you eat of it, you shall die." Well, he convinced her and she ate of it. And there's a lot of detail in there that we'll come to at another time. But then she gave it to her husband and he ate of it. Okay? And because of this disobedience, this sin, they were all condemned or cursed with something. The serpent was condemned to crawl in his belly all of his life and eat the dust of the ground. The woman was cursed to pain and suffering during her conception and menstrual cycle. The man was condemned, as we're going to see in a moment, to hard labor and death. But during that time, in the midst of that judgment, he also made a promise. Okay, and that promise was that he was going to send a seed of a woman, and that seed of the woman was going to crush the seed of the serpent. Okay, crush the head. Okay, which the head is about authority. Okay, so we need to know what these pictures are. The seed of the woman is Yeshua, the Messiah, the Savior, which I have mentioned before. The seed of the serpent is sin. Okay. Sin and death, because sin leads to death. That's what he did. He beguiled Eve, caused her to sin, and that sin eventually caused them to be cursed to death. So think of the seed of the serpent as sin and death. Right? Messiah was going to be sent to overcome or to crush the authority of sin and death, and we'll see that in the New Testament. It's in there everywhere. So we'll talk about that when we get there. What's important is to understand is that, first of all, when people say, what made man fall? And everybody say, well, he ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that is true, partially. But that's not the first sin he committed. The first and most important sin that he committed, the most relevant, is what Yah said to him. Listen to what he said. He said, "And to man, he, Yah, said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, saying, do not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you, and in toil you are to eat of it all the days of your life, and the ground shall bring forth thorns and thistles, and you shall eat the plants of the field, and by the sweat of the face you are to eat bread until the return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, and from dust you are, and to dust you shall return." See that? He said, because you listened to someone else instead of me. Okay? That's what he said. Because you listened to the voice of your wife and did what I told you not to do. It's because you listened to someone else and not me. This is super important because if you remember, Yah claims to be our Elohim. And the word Elohim, okay, refers to a place or position of power and authority. Okay, Yah because he's our creator, he alone is our power and authority. And he told Adam not to listen to anyone but himself. And Adam didn't listen. He listened to someone else. And when he listened to someone else, he caused him to commit sin. Okay, people ask me, well, is it sin that man has knowledge of good and evil? No, that's not sin. It's not wrong to have the knowledge of good and evil. That's what the Bible or the Torah is for, to teach us the difference between good and evil. That's what it's for. It's not about having the knowledge of good and evil that's sin. It's how he went about getting it. He got it through disobedience. Okay? The knowledge acquired through disobedience does not lead to life. It leads to death. As we see here, his punishment was what? Thorns and thistles, that's trials and tribulations. His life is going to be hard labor to eat. It's going to have struggles, thorns and thistles in his life, trials and tribulations. And the end of it was going to be physical death. He was going to die. That's the curse. Okay? But we got to remember also something here. The death that Adam, remember the command was, on the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. But he ate of it here and does not die. He doesn't die for another 800 years or so. So we have to understand that the death he received right now is spiritual death. That means that the connection, the relationship between him and the Father, the ability to commune together, that part of us that makes us like Yahweh, that part of us was broken, separated. Okay? That relationship was severed. And that is spiritual death. Our spirit can no longer commune with his spirit properly. Okay? Can no longer do that. And so our spirit has no power to force us or cause us to live righteously. It just doesn't have the power to do that. Our physical body, what Paul later calls his flesh, has the power to overcome us. We must diligently fight it all the time. We're going to see an example of that when we talk about Cain and Abel. But before we do that, so the death that Adam inherited and received immediately was spiritual death, the breaking of covenant with Yahweh, or breaking of communion, I should say. After that, he was exiled out of the garden. It says, and Yahweh Elohim said, see, the man has become like one of us to know the good and evil, and now, lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. So Yahweh Elohim sent him out of the garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken, and he drove man out. And then he placed two cherubim, two angels, at the east of the Garden of Eden, and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way of the tree of life. He did not want man in his fallen state, in the state of spiritual death, to eat of the tree of life and live forever physically. See, he didn't want everlasting physical life for man who was in spiritual death. Okay? He didn't want that for man. So once man became into a position of spiritual death, he removed man from the garden, taking away his ability to eat of the tree of life and live forever. Okay? So spiritual death came from our disobedience. Physical death came from our separation from the Garden of Eden, or the tree of life that's in the Garden of Eden. Okay? Where we have communion with Yahweh. This is always important. Okay? To have communion with Yahweh, you must be in a state of rightness or righteousness. To have communion with him. Okay? And it's only when you have communion with him that you have access to the tree of life. That's just the way it is, okay? That's the way the whole thing's set up. I don't make the rules, okay? So if you're not in communion with Yah, you are not walking in life. You just cannot be. Because he is life, and if you're not in communion with him, then you're in communion with death. That's just the way it is. Okay. Now, in Genesis chapter 5, verse 3, it says, we're going to find out, of course, that Adam had a third son. His name's Seth. He had other sons and daughters, but these are the ones that are named. Okay, and it says of Seth, he says in Genesis 5:3, And Adam lived 130 years and brought forth a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. This phrase, in his own likeness after his image, is saying that all his descendants, all those who were born after him, after he sinned, okay, all of these children were born under the curse of spiritual death. Okay? They were under the curse of spiritual death. That's the image, the likeness they inherited from their father. Spiritual death. So though they're born physically alive, they're in a state of spiritual death. Okay? That's the curse that man inherited from Adam. Spiritual death. Okay? All right, now, the scripture tells us, Paul talks about in Romans 3, that there's none righteous, no one. He's quoting the Psalms and the prophets when he talks about that there's none who's done right, all have sinned and come short of the glory of Elohim. Okay? What he's saying is that, listen, nobody lived righteously. Even though Yah gave us the standard of righteousness, his Torah, his law, that standard of righteousness, no one ever lived up to it. No one ever obeyed it. It's just not possible for men to keep it in its entirety. I mean, obeying the law is not hard, okay? The problem with obeying the law is what's in our heart, okay? What's in our heart that makes us, that causes us. It's not that we can't obey the Torah, it's that we don't want to. We don't want to, okay? That's the problem. And in that case, no one was ever righteous. And we weren't righteous for two reasons. One, our own disobedience, okay? And two, the death that we inherited from Adam. Paul says in Romans 5, starting in verse 12, he says, "For this reason, even as through one man sin did enter the world," that's Adam, "and death through sin, thus death spread to all men because all have sinned." Okay, death, we inherited death from Adam, and then we all acted on disobedience and earned death for ourselves. We've all, but these are the two spiritual deaths. We've inherited it and we've earned it. Okay? He said, "For until the Torah, sin was in the world, but sin was not reckoned when there was no Torah." What this has been misunderstood by most people. The word reckoned here means to be in a state of something, state of word or a place, or, okay. What it's really saying here is until the Torah was given, sin was in the world. There was people out there sinning, even though they didn't know what sin was, because there was no Torah to tell them. Okay? It wasn't until we got to the Torah, we read the Torah, that we realized, covetousness is sin. Paul talks about that in Romans 7. Okay. He's saying, but even though no one knew what sin was, or that what they were doing was sin, but death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who had not sinned, according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam, was the type of him that was come. So the only sin that Paul's alluding to is that the only sin they actually knew was the one that Adam did. Okay? And there was other people sinning and dying because of their sin, even though they didn't know what they were doing with sin. Didn't know. Okay? So ignorance was not an excuse in this situation. Okay? I want to go back a moment to what I said about Cain and Abel, because this is super important. In the situation between Cain and Abel, you can go read it, it's Genesis 4. When Yahweh kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden, he offered a sacrifice. He killed an animal to cover their nakedness, okay? Which is a sign that our nakedness or our sin is covered through the death of an animal. This is why later atonement comes from offering the blood of an animal, okay? Okay, that death, it covers. Okay? We'll get into more detail about that and explain it further at another time. Okay, but so he gave Adam and Eve and all and the children that were alive an example of what it has to take place for them to be accepted, for him to act on their behalf. Okay, you have to cover that nakedness or cover that sin. Okay, well, when it came time for them to offer sacrifice, Adam, their son Cain and Abel, to offer a sacrifice to Yah, Abel offered the life of an animal, which is what Yah had required in the garden. Okay? Cain did not do that. He did not want to offer that kind of offering. Instead, he brought from the fruit of the ground, the stuff he had planted and grown, and he gave it to Yahweh, expecting Yahweh to accept it. Okay, but Yahweh did not accept it. Why? Because it was not the kind of sacrifice required. The sacrifice required the death of an animal to cover the sin of man, at least as a symbol. Okay, it's a picture. It's something he's trying to teach us. Okay, later we're going to find out that the blood of bulls and goats never, ever could take away sin. It doesn't have the ability to do so. That's why Messiah had to offer himself. But the thing is, it's showing us something. Death. Okay, death has to take place when sin is present. A death has to take place. Cain didn't do that. So when Cain was rejected, he got angry. And when he got angry, Yah said to him, "Is it not if you do good, you are to be accepted? And if you do not do good, towards the door is sin." Towards the door, referring to the door of his heart. He, sin, is lying, and toward you is his desire, but you must rule over him. So what is he telling? He says, listen, within you is this sin, this part of you that desires to control your heart. Okay? And he's crouching there, waiting to spring on it, take control of you. You must rule over him. If you go to Romans 7, Paul talks about this. Paul talks about, though I want to do good, evil is present in me. Okay? He says in verse 21, I find therefore this law, that when I wish to do good, that evil is present in me. Now later, he's going to call that evil, okay? He's going to call it his flesh. And it's a reference to our physical body. You know, everybody's afraid of Satan, and to some degree there should be. But he's not our greatest enemy. He's a whisperer, like in the garden. He can't make you do anything unless you surrender yourself to him. Okay? He's a whisperer, a tempter, an accuser. Your real enemy is yourself, your flesh. So you have this two parts. The parts that's like Yahweh, but unfortunately that was born dead. The connection between it and Yahweh was dead because of we inherited Adam's spiritual death from Adam. And then there's this physical body that only cares about its own thing, cares about eating and drinking and, you know, having its way, getting its way, selfish. Okay, it's no different than the cat and the dog that act on instinct, only behave based on the senses, you know, instinctual. They don't have the ability to reason in a spiritual manner, to know, to act on what they know above how they feel or what their instincts tell them. Sure, that they can be trained to ignore their instincts, okay, but they still can't reason why. They're just doing what you train them to do. All right. So it's important here that we understand that all of us were born physically alive but spiritually dead. Okay? So in this situation, no amount of good works, no matter how much good works we did, those good works could not give the dead spirit man life again. He was already dead. Okay? The Torah was given for us to live by, meaning that if we do it, we will live by it. Okay? But it can only make this physical man live rightly. It can't make the spiritual man alive from the dead. He's already condemned to death. So the only way this death, this dead man can be made alive again is if a death took place that could pay the penalty of death that was hovering over it. I'm not sure if that made sense. But when Messiah offered his life, our belief in his sacrifice, it forgave, according to Paul in Romans 3:25. Our belief in his blood, justified us or made us right or made us innocent, from past sin and the death that acquired from it. It was about the sin of the past. That's what Messiah's sacrifice came to do. It came to pay that penalty. And by paying that penalty, what it did, it gave new life to the inner spiritual man. That man that was dead has been made alive again through faith in Yeshua Messiah. That's what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2. We were dead in trespasses and sins, but now we've been made alive again through belief in Yeshua Messiah. That's what Paul's argument is. So the new man, the spiritual man, has been born again. So now we're back in the state Adam was in before he sinned, spiritually alive and physically alive. We've been made new again, brand new creature, just like Adam in the beginning. So now we have to decide, are we going to follow the footsteps of Adam, or are we going to follow in the footsteps of Yeshua, who delivered us from the consequences of Adam's disobedience? If we follow the footsteps of Adam, we're going to do the same thing Adam did, who was alive and became dead because he wouldn't obey. Messiah was born alive and earned life, meaning life everlasting, because his spiritual life, that spiritual righteousness that he was born with, that we were not, because he had a different father. His father was Yahweh, he didn't have a human father to inherit spiritual death. So he was born in spiritual life. He lived that spiritual life in obedience to the Torah. So his spiritual life a righteous spiritual life was followed by a righteous physical life. And these two together made him complete, whole. And in that wholeness, he inherited the resurrection. And we have to follow the same pattern. Once we've been made alive again spiritually, we have to make a choice every day to live spiritually. Paul says, the law, the Torah of Yahweh, is holy and just, righteous and good, and it is spiritual. So if a new believer wants to be holy, just, righteous, and good, and live spiritually, he must obey the Torah. Messiah did it. Paul did it. All these guys did it. But because men came along later who didn't want to do it, they've taken what Paul has said, they've turned it upside down. To say, now that we're in Jesus, we no longer have to obey the Torah. He did it for us. Yes, he did it for us as an example of how we are to do it. He's our example to follow. That's why it tells us to imitate him, to walk as he walked, because he set an example of how we are to live in him by his obedience. We are to follow that obedience. People are going to say, now you're saying that we have to obey the law to be saved. No, you were justified because you believed. That made you spiritually alive again. That's the salvation Paul's talking about. You were saved from sin and death, made alive again in Yeshua. Being made alive again in Yeshua, being justified, being saved from sin and death is not the same thing as inheriting the kingdom. All those people back in Egypt were delivered from death by the Passover lamb. Their firstborn, right? Death passed over them because of the blood of the Passover lamb, just like the death you owed was passed over you when Messiah offered his blood. And you believed in that blood, the sin debt was passed away, passed off of you. Okay, it's the same thing. But most of those people, that first generation of men who offered the Passover lamb and eventually were delivered out of Egypt, that generation did not inherit the promised land, because even though they were justified, even though they were saved out of Egypt, they refused to obey. And their refusal to obey prevented them from inheriting. Don't get it twisted. As Paul says in Romans 15, I think 4, and he also says in Corinthians and 10, and it's again in Hebrews 4, we are told that the thing that happened there is for our education. They're examples that we don't make the same mistakes they do. What was their mistake? Disobeying. Their mistake was disobeying. They were delivered. They heard the words of life. Yahweh told them, if you obey my voice, that's about the written law, the Torah, how we live, and keep my covenant, that's about our belief, spiritual, okay, what we're trusting in, blood, the blood of Messiah, the blood of the Passover lamb, blah, blah, blah. So, covenant and obedience. Covenant and obedience. If you do this, I shall make you a segula, a peculiar people. It takes these two things, belief and obedience. Isaiah says about false teachers, okay, it's the Torah and the witness, the law and the Messiah. It's the Torah and the witness. If they do not speak this word, Torah and Messiah, there is no light in them. Isaiah 20. Messiah said, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Father. Matthew 4:4. Okay. He calls himself later the bread of life. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word. Messiah and the Torah. Messiah and the Torah. Messiah tells John in Revelation 14:12, this is the patience or endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of Elohim and have faith in Yeshua Messiah. It requires both. Messiah justifies you from sin and death. Faith in him, walked in obedience, sanctifies you unto the resurrection, which is glorification. Those two must work together. Your justification is lived in righteousness. These two make you holy, and holiness ends in eternal life. That's how it goes. Go read Romans 6. All right, that's enough for now. We'll come back next time with something interesting, I hope. Thanks for joining.